Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us tonight to hear Andy Thomason discuss his recently published book, Discredited, the UNC Scandal and College Athletics Amateur Ideal. He's joined in conversation by Praveena Somasundaram, editor of UNC's daily Tar Heel student newspaper. My name is Maggie. I'm the marketing and events manager here at Flyleaf. Thanks for coming tonight and supporting our small business by purchasing a copy of Andy's book from us. To provide access to our events and for our community, we are recording tonight's event and we'll be posting it to our YouTube channel in the coming days. Andy has already signed and personalized your books before the talk. We do close the public at 7 tonight, so we're asking Andy and Praveena to conclude before then so we can be mindful of our colleagues that are closing up the store. And now I'd like to briefly introduce our guests. Andy Thomason is an assistant managing editor at the Chronicle for Higher Education, supervising news and accountability coverage. He's a former editor of the daily Tar Heel, and Discredited is his first book. Praveena Somasundaram is the editor-in-chief of the daily Tar Heel, UNC Chapel Hill's independent student newspaper. She's previously interned on the Metro desk of the Charlotte Observer and the breaking news hub at the Dallas Morning News. She will graduate from UNC this spring with degrees in biology and journalism.
Well, thank you for the introductions. I'm really excited to be here to talk about this book. Thank you all for coming and to be in conversation with the former editor-in-chief who I look up to. But just kind of set the stage for us, I think Andy's going to do a little bit of a reading from the book so we can start.
Thank you, Praveena. Yeah, I think I've got my mic here, and just let me know if y'all can't hear me. I will speak up. So I'm going to read first, and yeah, let's go. The University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill is among a few hundred colleges that participate in big-time sports, the football and basketball programs that provide one of the major sources of entertainment in American life. Every one of these colleges signs on to a dubious assertion that the young people who play on these teams are students first, athletes second. Yet this ideal of amateurism is a myth that collapses under the mildest bit of scrutiny. The lives of most of the athletes who compete in the highest tier of college sports bear only a passing resemblance to those of their classmates. At universities like UNC, many of these students are admitted under different standards than non-athletes. When they get to campus, they have access to a separate team of academic advisors and tutors charged with ensuring their success or at least preserving their eligibility. Meanwhile, a grueling schedule of practice and competition dominates their days, making coursework something close to an afterthought. This myth serves a clear purpose. By espousing amateurism, colleges prohibit their athletes from freely earning money for their labor. Amateurism thus helps preserve big-time college athletics as it is today, a system that drives hundreds of millions of dollars to universities and television networks, but a piddly amount to the athletes themselves. It is through this system that universities can court donors, satisfy the public, and celebrate their histories. The amateur myth is a source of value for these schools, both financially and emotionally. But it also carries costs, and not only for the athletes. The gulf between the players' lives and those of the students they are supposed to resemble creates seismic waves that travel far beyond the walls of the athletic department. It takes a village to make the amateur myth seem true. It is only accomplished, one UNC professor later wrote, through the resourceful manipulation of smoke and mirrors and by a lot of winking and nodding. Coaches wink, professors nod. Advisors wink, chancellors nod. For many years in Chapel Hill, only amateurism's benefits were visible to the outside world. Once the cracks began to show, the costs of amateurism, hidden for all those years, finally became visible. The result was one of the most heinous sports scandals to visit a college in decades, succeeded only by the criminal trials involving Penn State and Michigan State. This book, based on dozens of interviews and thousands of pages of documents, is a story of the myth of amateurism in 3 acts, how UNC embraced it, then watched in horror as the myth came unraveled, and finally embraced it again. At its core, this story is about a secretary who made it a personal mission to bridge the contradictions of amateurism, bringing scrutiny onto a university that had escaped it for half a century. Amateurism was the clear cause of this scandal, yet the university never seriously entertained the notion that it should de-emphasize its athletic enterprise or re-examine its allegiance to the amateur ideal. Indeed, the lengths to which it went and the conditions it endured to preserve its athletic dominance were extreme. Careers were ruined, a whole discipline shrouded in suspicion, lives soured. Much has been written about the substantial costs of amateurism to the athletes who must sign on to it. Comparatively little has been written of late about the cost to the institutions of higher learning. As the public increasingly decries the exploitative effects of amateurism, the university presidents who endorse it may be forced to adapt. They would do well to look to Chapel Hill as a cautionary tale. The cost of American intercollegiate athletics may far exceed athletes' unpaid wages. at stake is nothing less than the moral standing of the most powerful intellectual institutions in the world.
Yes, well, thank you for the reading. And as you alluded in that, like, this story has gone on for years, but it first broke when you were a sophomore at UNC and as you're becoming an editor at the Daily Tar Heel. And as a student journalist myself, I'm curious about what made you want to follow this story through and kind of like the differences between when you were covering it as a student versus being able to write and publish this book now as a professional journalist.
Well, first of all, thank you, Praveena, for moderating. Thanks to everybody for turning out. And like you said, Praveena, the story broke when I was a sophomore in college in the year 2010. And it is hard. Some of you who are here tonight were around when it was happening, and it's hard to overstate what a big deal it was on campus. And so from that moment, in 2010, all the way to 2013 when I graduated, this story was going on. It hadn't ended, it had only evolved, and it had only gained in intensity. And there were only more questions that we were trying to sort out. And then after I left, I went to the Chronicle of Higher Education, started working there in 2014, and the Chronicle was covering it also because it was a huge story in higher education. And then the story only wrapped up in 2017, but back to your original question. What made me want to write this was that I felt as though the truth of what happened here had never been fully unearthed. And what I mean by that is we had learned lots of facts, but there hadn't been a whole lot of grappling with what were the root subterranean causes of this scandal, what made it, in a sense, inevitable. And that was the view that I came to take. So this is a great question because one of the key things that I learned about journalism and a couple of other things is that when you have some distance from a big event, you can go back and look at the conditions that happened on the ground and wonder, was this a healthy way? I mean, as journalists, we think about this a lot. Was this a healthy way to grapple with this scandal and what happened here? All of this, who did what, who were the villains, et cetera. And when you have some distance from that, you can look at the history and sort out what were the conditions that allowed this to fester. And I felt as though it's a story that so many people cared about that there hadn't been a lot of grappling with the bigger issues. So that's what made me really excited about doing the book.
It's weird to hear 2010 because I was 10 years old at the time.
There you go.
So I was not around, but I'm glad to be here now.
Great.
And kind of like you alluded to in the reading as well, what the story is about at its core, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about kind of the main characters of your book and a little bit about the role that they played.
Sure. I'll start by reminding everybody about what exactly this scandal was. And that was, for a couple of decades, starting in the 90s and ending in 2009, there were a series of phantom courses that sprung up on UNC's campus that were used by athletic advisors and others on campus to route students who needed good grades in certain types of classes too. And the reason it was a scandal is that over 3,000 students over a period of, I think, about 18 years utilized these classes, and it was a scandal because a disproportionate share of those students were UNC's athletes. And there had been a lot of pressure from the athletic advising office to route certain students to these classes to keep their grades up, keep them eligible to play. And the reason that was such a big deal at UNC was that for the decades prior, the university had cultivated an identity that was very much, we can do both athletics and academics well. We can be the best at both. And this was personified in the character of Dean Smith, the legendary basketball coach. So it built up this mythology, and it was kind of like a bubble that popped in 2010 through 2012 as people realized that maybe it wasn't as true as we thought it was, and that created a big furor. And to your question about characters, how do you tell a story from beginning to end, spanning decades? And I chose 4 characters, 4 real life people who I thought their lives were intertwined with this whole thing. And we have to start with the first character, the first of 4, and her name is Debbie Crowder. She was a secretary in the what was then called the Department of African and Afro-American Studies at UNC. It's since been renamed. And this was a woman who worked at UNC for decades and decades, was a well-loved figure at the college, helped countless students who were going through personal problems, academic problems, getting them in classes that they needed to have. And she was the one who more or less created this system of classes. And the origin of the classes it's kind of technical. It's honestly kind of boring compared to the reputation that they came to take up. But she loomed large on this story because she was sort of considered the architect. The second important character is a woman named Jan Boxhall, who was an athletic advisor starting in the 90s and was also a UNC philosophy professor. She later became chair of the faculty. When the most exhaustive investigation about these classes came out, it purported to show that Jan was an active participant in this scandal. And she was forced out of UNC afterward. And she's the main character in this book because I sat down with her for hours to talk about her role and everything. And character number 3 is a woman named Mary Willingham, who worked in the academic advising office with Jan. And she came to be a whistleblower after she felt really uncomfortable with the way UNC was talking publicly about this scandal. And so she sort of took on a reputation as a truth teller and faced a lot of blowback from the university and from the community. And then finally, a character who kind of populates the very middle of the book is former chancellor of UNC named Holden Thorpe, who was at the helm for a good portion of the response to the scandal. And he is an interesting case study, and there's a lot of contemporary resonance today that I think we'll get to about how do you manage something as complicated as a college, especially in a time of turmoil. And he is essentially at the reins when they start finding out about this, the wrongdoing, and he finds himself in a position where he has to try to manage it and eventually finds that it's not possible for him to manage. And so he ends up resigning. So it's through those 4 people that I try to tell this story.
Yeah, and you mentioned that you'd sat down with some of them for hours and you looked at thousands of pages of documents. And so I was wondering if you could also talk a little bit about that reporting process, and also if you came upon any surprises, twists, complexities that you didn't know of when you first started covering the story in the process for the book.
Sure. About the reporting process, one of the pieces of advice, Maggie mentioned that this is my first book. One of the pieces of advice I would give someone who wants to write a nonfiction book is choose a story that has a gigantic paper trail, because this story has it. There are, I think, something like hundreds of thousands of documents just sitting on the internet that UNC was forced to put out after the scandal had taken up 6 years of terrible headlines and legal fees. They finally decided we're just going to release everything. And so that was a step of transparency at the time and a gift to me later, being able to page through those. So that was some of the reporting, was just looking at already public documents, trying to piece together a timeline and a record of how things happened the way that they did. And then the other one was I would come here and I would sit over at the root cellar right next door and sit down with people who were around at the time, who played a role and who told me what they could about what they remembered. And so that was interesting, because one of the things that I found is that this is a traumatic story for a not insignificant number of people who were on the ground at the time, had their lives turned upside down, and who eventually had to make sense of things, or attempt to, years later, still feeling the effects of what happened. That is an interesting and complex reporting challenge to try and listen to that, figure out how to convey their stories in a book form. And then, so that sort of contemporary stuff is useful to hear recollections and to look at documents. But you asked about what are some surprising things along the way. And I would say that the biggest surprise that I came upon is that how far back you have to go to figure out why this scandal happened the way that it did. And I only discovered this fully later in the reporting process, but this book pretty much opens with a story that begins in the 1930s when a UNC president named Frank Porter Graham looked at the college athletics landscape, which was back then similarly situated to what it is today, which is there are players taking money under the table, there are campuses pouring money into football, trying to use it as kind of a reputational booster, and there's all of a sudden a market for athletic talent on college campuses. So back in the 30s, it was more of a Wild West mentality. The NCAA was not the hegemonic force that it is today. And there was a question about, can we give out athletic scholarships? Is that something we can do? Can we pay players to play? Can we subsidize athletics on this campus? And the UNC president at the time, Frank Porter Graham, looked ahead as UNC was setting this policy, and he said, we really should avoid giving out athletic scholarships, because as soon as we subsidize a certain type of student, it's going to create a division. It's going to create problems that we can't even imagine how they'll manifest themselves in the days ahead. Of course, the NCAA eventually allows athletic scholarships, which is, and this is not a bad thing, but athletic scholarships are pay for play. It is essentially an employment arrangement. The NCAA has so thoroughly dominated the messaging around this that we think about it in a weird way. We think, no, they're student athletes, but as soon as you subsidize a certain type of student, it is payment, and that's not a bad thing. But basically what happened from then on is the NCAA adopted the student athlete label, which attempts to convince society that athletes do not face pressures or incentives that other students don't. So they are just like regular students, and because of that, they are not employees, and therefore we do not have to pay them in accordance with federal law. We don't have to give them workers' comp, that sort of thing. So for decades and up till today, this idea has dominated. But in the 90s and the 80s, the public is starting to get a sense of the sordid nature of this and how athletes are coming out saying that they're illiterate, they weren't given a proper education. So the NCAA starts putting money into academic standards, into academic advising offices like what I described in this book to shore up this notion of the student athlete. But what that does is it creates work around the margins of college athletes' educational experiences. It hires advisors to make sure they're staying eligible. Admissions exceptions spring up, including at UNC. And these paper classes are just a symptom of that, right? So this is an extremely long way of answering your question, which is that the most surprising thing I learned is that this scandal was a culmination not of just 2 decades of actions, but rather 90, if not more, years of decisions and of developments. And the people who were on the ground when this happened, they just found themselves having to deal with something that was in the making for longer than any of us have been alive. So that was the most surprising thing that I learned.
I'm glad that you mentioned like this system of the paper classes and the people on the ground. I know the African and Afro-American Studies Department was kind of like one of the focal points of this scandal, even though it only housed some, but not all of the paper classes. And you mentioned some of the other departments in your book. I was wondering if you could talk about the focus on that department specifically and like what it means about the racial disparities at UNC at that time and also the ones that might persist today.
Sure. So the paper classes, there were let's see how to put this. So the paper classes, as they're known today, were all housed in what was then called the African and Afro-American Studies Department, but there was other knowledge scattered around the campus, knowledge of the classes. But basically what happened was, in 2011, when people found out about these classes, UNC was not very forthcoming. I know that's not going to surprise you. UNC was not very forthcoming about what it knew and about efforts that it was taking to try and get to the truth. So what prevailed when all we knew was that there were these couple classes that we found out about where a bunch of athletes were in them, and maybe there weren't, maybe that they were more lax, and all we knew was that they'd existed. UNC was investigating, but we didn't know anything else. There was no other really public knowledge at the time. So what then springs up, everybody just starts lobbing claims and accusations around. And when you're talking about the Black Studies department at UNC, you can imagine what character those claims start to take on in the South in the year 2011. And it got ugly. And just to give one of the rewarding parts about doing this book is, I dug way back into the history of the department at UNC, because that's an inseparable part of this story. And one African studies scholar told me when I was interviewing her for the book that Black studies on American college campuses is not encouraged; it's tolerated for the most part. And that is something you see in the history of this department at UNC, which is literally came out of student demands in the late 60s, along with many other departments across the country. And it had to fight for departmental status for decades and decades and decades. And there are lots of fights for new faculty lines, for it to have a reputation that in keeping with the great scholars who have been in and out of the department, including many who remain there today. And but back to 2011. So when we have an absence of information about what exactly happened, all of a sudden you have board members in the UNC system suggesting that the department be eliminated. You have people writing letters to the editor in all the regional papers saying that, why do we have this department anyway? And that's a racist thing to say for an academic discipline that is just as legitimate as other departments that populate UNC's campus. There's a nasty context to remarks like that. And the way that one of the ways I illustrated in the book, it's kind of an interesting side story, is that I believe it's in 2011, there was a physics scholar who got arrested in Argentina for essentially being a drug mule, and a bunch of professors on campus. And the provost cut his salary, because he was in jail. He was in jail in Argentina, and they were like, that's what he said. He said I was working. I'm working. So he protested the fact that the provost cut his salary. And was like, you can't. Obviously, you're not working since you're in jail. But he was like, I am supervising my grad students, so I should have my salary. So a bunch of professors on campus are like, this is wrong. We've got to. You can't cut this. This is a tenured professor. You can't cut his salary. So like a petition comes out and everything. This is at the very same time that everybody's floating accusations, rumors about the Department of African and Afro-American Studies. And one of the scholars did an oral history interview years later where he recalled feeling like, this is insane, that nobody is coming to me and my colleagues' aid at a time of need to try and push back some of these unfair criticisms. Meanwhile, a physics scholar is getting people lining up in support of him for a way more sordid set of allegations than what was at issue in the academic scandal. That to him was emblematic of a really, really troubled culture. And this scholar ended up years later being so depressed and so upset by what he endured as a tenured professor at UNC as part of that department that he gave up his emeritus status and after he retired and just said, I can't even step on campus anymore. It's too upsetting. And look, we see I wrote an excerpt of an adapted essay from my book in the Chronicle where I connected these lessons to what the campus recently endured with the controversy surrounding the tenure bid of Nicole Hannah-Jones. And what you saw after that episode was scholars and staff and students speaking out saying that this is a culture that has racist roots that are still manifesting themselves today in a way that makes us feel unwelcome. And that was the same thing that was happening 10 years ago in the midst of the scandal. And what we see is that, this is still manifesting today. These forces are still at work, and it's a culture that obviously the university has to deal with and face up to.
Yeah, and I think going back to kind of the underlying thread for this culture is the university not being forthcoming, which I experience a lot of as the editor of the DTH. But with the situation surrounding Nicole Hannah-Jones' tenure and also this story, there were multiple investigations from the university and the NCAA. There were still things that were being found out. And I'm really interested by the role of the press in all of this. You mentioned in your book about Dan Kane's investigation from the Raleigh News and Observer, as well as the NNO's editorials, which were sent from professors to administrators. So I was wondering if you could talk about, at the time, what the press's role in the story was.
That's a great question, because this was one of the most interesting and most troubling, in a way, things that I discovered. So anybody who was there at the time knows that Dan Kane was, in many ways, appeared to be, and was in some cases, the only force that was giving us new information about what had happened here, because the circle of people who kind of knew how these classes work was very small, and the two major people were not on campus anywhere. They weren't employed after a certain point, so there's only so much we can find out. So stories from the News and Observer, stories from the Daily Tar Heel, stories from other local outlets were critical in trying to wrench some of this information out and doing exactly what journalists should do in educating the public on public business. So that was a really good thing, and Dan in particular did a ton of great work, investigatory work that actually inspired the direction that the UNC investigation took at a certain stage. And I'll just give a brief example. So the very first investigation UNC did into the paper classes, Holden Thorpe, who was the chancellor at the time, told me that the reason that he set the parameters of this investigation to be 2007 to 2011 was because that was the period that Dan Kane had asked for in a recent records request. And he was like, okay, well, you'll just give them what they want, right? So that's a really healthy way in which interest from journalists can directly influence in a positive way the way that public servants actually do their work. But what I also discovered, it's a really double-edged sword, because on the one hand, the press was a very healthy influence on getting some of this information out. On the other hand, and I alluded to this earlier, we have to reckon with the fact that in some situations, media outlets can amplify really harmful rhetoric, including stereotypes. I mentioned the stuff about Black studies earlier. That's one way. And also just sort of anybody who was around at the time knows that this was a total media circus at some points. News vans all over campus, set up outside the Department of African and Afro-American Studies at points, and just elsewhere on campus, because it was such a huge story. And one of the things I encountered in doing interviews with people who were there is just that that attention that was amplified by media outlets, including one that I was involved in, the DTH, was very personally harmful to some people. And that's something that we as journalists like to believe, that we're white knights in a lot of cases who swoop in, tell the truth, and wipe our hands, and that's it. But we have to grapple with the fact that we are absolutely actors in stories like this, and sometimes we can do harm as well as doing good. And that was something that I hadn't grasped until I had revisited the story and gone back to the people who were there and talked through what it was like to work as a non-public figure, person who nobody knew for decades, and then all of a sudden your picture's on the nightly news. And what does that do to a person? How does that make them feel? And so I'm glad you asked about the role of journalists, because I came away with a much more complicated notion of culpability and all of those things as it relates to journalism.
You kind of touched on this already a little bit, but of all of the issues that you present in your book surrounding the university and everything that happened with this scandal, what remnants are we still seeing today, and how do you see them kind of still playing a role in everything happening on campus now?
So there are two major ones that come up. One is really central to this book, which is that the Chancellor Holdethorpe, when this scandal came to his desk in 2010, he all of a sudden confronted a morass of different incentives that dictated how he dealt with it. You have, if you're the Chancellor of UNC, you report to your board, but there are other interested parties, and you're always taking people's temperatures. You have your provost who might have an opinion. You have prominent donors who might have an opinion. You have board members who have an opinion. You have members of the state legislature who also have an opinion, and you have faculty, staff, and students who also have an opinion. You're trying to juggle all this stuff. You're trying to figure out, okay, well, I have to take action here. I've got to investigate the wrongdoing. But also, I'm having all these fans who are telling me that everything's fine. I even have some board members saying that what we should do is just say everything's good, there's nothing wrong here, nothing to see here, and let's just power through these negative headlines. And so he finds himself in a decision where he's looking at all these forces, trying to figure out the best way forward. He takes actions, and maybe one constituency is satisfied with something, but that makes the other constituency really mad, and then there's a new editorial in NNO that puts him in the hot seat, and he's constantly trying to satisfy these constituencies, and ultimately he came to the decision that there was no way he could satisfy everybody, and he had run out of political capital, and that was it. He had to resign. So this has only gotten worse since 2013, and a lot of that is political because of the takeover of the Board of Governors by Republicans in the state and the Republican power brokers, who have shown a concerted interest in what goes on at UNC, how UNC does its business. We saw that, we see that to some degree in the Silent Sam controversy. We see that to some degree in the Nicole Hannah-Jones controversy, and we see it in something that I think would have been unbelievable just 2 years ago, which is that the university doesn't do a common sense thing like mandating vaccines because of the political, because it's a political issue, and they would find it damaging to the university's relationship with politicians in the state. And that's not limited to UNC, that's something that's happening nationwide. But these forces have only gotten worse because politicians have only become more enthusiastic about seeing themselves represented in the affairs of the university. So it's, whenever you look at the current chancellor of UNC and what he's going through, it's more complicated and much harder even than what Holdethorpe found was an impossible way to manage a university. The other thing is, one of the major findings of my book is, I already talked about how there were long-term issues at the root of what happened here that dictated the direction of this scandal. The university made it so that a scandal that looked exactly like this was never going to happen again. They instituted lots of different checks, lots of different reforms, but obviously they did not correct the root cause of this scandal. This is one of my findings, that as long as universities are adhering to the NCAA's ideal of the student athlete, that there are always going to be these pressures that pull a campus apart, that pull some athletes themselves apart by incentivizing big-time athletes to focus first and foremost on their athletic lives, and then in a lot of cases coming back, they find themselves looking at loopholes at certain types of classes and that sort of thing. That's a recipe for scandal, and that remains the case today at UNC and lots of colleges throughout the country. Those are two ways in which this scandal remains extremely current and extremely relevant today.
Yeah, and kind of going off of the NCAA and the university, obviously this summer there was kind of a shift and a reversal with the name, image, and likeness policy with the NCAA, and I think I would love to hear your thoughts on how that fits into this kind of conflict over compensation of athletes. That's a big theme in your book.
Yep. Yeah, so that's a great question, and what we saw this summer is that yeah, starting last year, a bunch of states got together and finally began to pass name, image, likeness laws, which basically say that colleges cannot bar athletes from being paid by from making money off of their name, image, likeness, stuff like autographs, stuff like endorsements, ads, that sort of thing, because the NCAA has long barred athletes from making any money off the fact that they are athletes. So a bunch of politicians from both parties got together and said, "This is crazy. We can't allow this anymore." Universities are still allowed to get together to decide that they themselves can't pay athletes above the value of a scholarship, but other people can. So we see a lot of the biggest names in college athletics who are now able to make money, and that's definitely a welcome development for people who are concerned about economic exploitation of college athletes. That's one of the biggest reforms in this space that we've seen for decades. But it does not, the NCAA has still clung to this central plank at the center of amateurism, which is that athletes must be students and must also be athletes, and we are still going to enforce these academic standards. So in one way, this has been a welcome release valve for the most pressing notion among reformers, which is that we have to stop economically and exploiting these athletes. But it does not address the conflict at the center of the book, which is that by pretending that big-time athletes don't face extraordinary pressures that are not faced by other students, we create conflict at the heart of both athletes and the campuses that they're on that can manifest itself in the form of big scandals like what we saw at UNC. So, but we're going to see more on this topic because the NCAA is rewriting its constitution. They had a devastating loss at the Supreme Court this past summer over a case related to compensation over the value of a scholarship, and that has prompted the college presidents who make up the key governing body of the NCAA to decide that there needs to be rewriting of the Constitution. So we very well could see reforms that touch the issues at the heart of this book. People are not super optimistic that that's going to happen because the body of evidence we have from the association over the decades is that they have, it's not characteristic of large dominant associations to cede their power. So nobody's expecting that. But it's within the realm of possibility that we could see reforms that drastically change the landscape. So we're looking out for that.
And I'll just ask one more question before we open it up to questions from you all. This goes back to your reading and the answer to the first question, which is this idea of the Carolina Way. And as you said, it kind of started with Dean Smith and how we can have both stellar athletes, but also still be keen on academics. And so I was wondering, in the decade since this story first broke, how we've seen the Carolina Way, so to speak, manifest itself. And if you could talk a little bit about the form that it's in today.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So to give just a brief reminder, this idea of the Carolina Way really originated with Dean Smith and the idea that during the 1980s, the 70s, 80s, and 90s, at a time when the dominant narrative in college sports was that this enterprise is growing, but at the same time we're seeing scandal on this. We're seeing some of the first huge scandals in college athletics happen at that time, and UNC basketball especially shines as is sort of a shining light, saying that nope, it can be done the right way. It can be done the good way because you have Dean Smith, who is a well-respected leader, a progressive icon, and a team that sports a near 100% graduation rate, and they win national titles. And so this is a narrative that lasts for decades and decades until the balloon is kind of popped in the 2010s. The way that I can best answer your question about what form it's in today is that in 2014, after the university released what it billed as its most comprehensive investigation on this scandal, they took this document, which sort of laid out all of these findings from this former federal prosecutor, and basically they had one press conference where the chancellor, or they had their first press conference after the release. Somebody asked basically like, well, listen, the findings of this report, don't they kind of legitimize all the critiques we've been hearing about how a lot of athletes come in unprepared, and then through really no individual act of evil, a lot of loopholes and shortcuts spring up because systems, a lot of times, when the easiest thing to do is create a shortcut, that just happens. It's not through any horrible individual wrongdoing. Doesn't this legitimize this idea that these are systemic forces? If you really want to curb this in the future, you should address the root causes here, which in this case, the person was asking are admitting athletes who are not prepared for whatever environment prevails at UNC. And the chancellor's answer sort of came to define UNC's response to this, which is, nope, this was a handful of people who decided that they knew better than to trust. They knew better than to rely on existing sources of help that we had. So they fired a bunch of people and they attempted to move on, and the scandal came to an end, essentially. So the UNC after that has sort of tried to hold on to this notion that athletics and academics are perfectly in concert. And I wouldn't, this is kind of related, and I would be remiss to not mention this, but in some ways, some of the most interesting things that happen in this story happen after the release of this report. And one of them is that, so the UNC holds up this comprehensive report and says, this is the definitive thing, we trust this, this is going to put an end to everything because finally we're excavating we've gotten to the truth here. This is called the Weinstein Report. And a couple of years go by, they take disciplinary action based on this report against a handful of people who they deem had acted inappropriately. Then the NCAA gets interested in this scandal because a lot of people are saying, how can you not punish the university after they've admitted to doing all this stuff, having classes that disproportionately benefited athletes? That's a clear impermissible benefit. So the NCAA launches an investigation and starts to attempt to punish UNC through its infractions process. And the university decides that we're just gonna fight this because that's what universities do when the NCAA comes after them. The ones that have enough money to hire the top lawyers, the people who have worked for the NCAA before and know how it works, will do a scorched earth strategy and fight it, and that's what UNC did. So much so that UNC actually backed away from the Weinstein Report. They said, this is actually not the great report you guys think it is. And they commissioned this report, celebrated it when it came out, and then decided, it was the same chancellor the whole time, the same leadership team, and they said, there's some real flaws with this report, so we don't want you guys to be taking it too seriously. So there are all these footnotes where they're like, they did this and that, the lawyers poured through the report and were like, this analysis is not perfect. And so they sent back this response, and they completely backed away from the report that they used to discipline all these people, right? And so, and they relied on a loophole that the NCAA has that says colleges get to determine what constitutes academic fraud. Because we're just the NCAA, we can't say that what happens inside a classroom, we can't make heads or tails of that. That's not our jurisdiction. So UNC utilized that, and they prevailed in the case of the NCAA. They were not punished, which was a big surprise and and was galling to a lot of people out there in the sports world. And UNC actually went as far as saying that a couple of years prior they had responded to their accrediting agency by admitting that there had been academic fraud, that had happened for years and years and years. We admit it, this happened. And the NCAA went to them and said, well, you told your accreditor that academic fraud happened here. We're trying to punish you for academic fraud. You're saying you didn't commit any academic fraud, but here you're saying it. And the university responded by saying that statement to their accreditor was a typo. And the NCAA Committee on Infractions, they had to they just said, well, our rules say that you get to decide, so you've decided that I guess it was both, but now it's not academic fraud, so we're going to step back. This is a way in which we see the institutions, the incentives that drive institutional behavior often overrule the principles that universities say they are guided by. It is often the most pressing concerns that dictate an institutional response, not things like the Carolina way, the things that we say drive us to be better. It's often the sort of uglier factors that determine how universities and other institutions behave. So that's a long way to answer your question.
I appreciated that. Well, do any of you all have questions? I think we have about 15 minutes left with Andy, so if anyone would like to ask a question, feel free to do so.
You mentioned the changes that happened this summer with athletes being able to sell their likeness and endorse and that kind of thing. Characterized as a reform. Is it? I wonder whether it is or not, and whether or not it's just like decriminalization. Because if it just seems to me to invite a local, let's say, car dealership to partner up with a university coach and offer it to recruits. But now it's legal. If it was bad before, now we're just saying it's not. We're just defining it as not being bad any longer. And so along that line, and whatever that reform spectrum turns out to be, I mean, is that just the direction we're going to be heading? And so is that where you see it going? We just have to get used to things we thought we didn't like?
That's a great question and a really interesting analogy. I do believe that greater economic latitude for college athletes that participate, that play on the biggest stages in the sport, I think that is where we're headed. Yeah, based on what the evidence that I see out there in the world. Now, as to your analogy about decriminalization, keep in mind that the way that this has worked for decades at colleges like UNC is donors pay into the scholarship fund that then gets distributed. So what you're seeing is, in some ways, the university is just sort of the middleman for the payment that before that had existed under the table from donors to directly to athletes, right? So, and this goes back to what I was saying about how, in a very technical way, athletic scholarships are pay for play because they incentivize a certain quality among students, and that's athletic ability. I think there's something to your decriminalization analogy, because yes, it is a way for the NCAA to just sort of take a step back and say, this thing that we have said is wrong, now we are legally required to do it. And there are a lot of open questions about, I mean, you talked about whether a car dealership could make a deal with a coach. There is not a lot of regulation in the NIL space right now. And maybe there will be someday, or maybe there's going to be some new development. Maybe NCAA will come up with something that works here. But their response so far has kind of been like, you guys figure this out, right? So we're seeing a ton of different stuff on campuses. But the foundational thing here is that there is only so long that a system can persist in which an assistant coach at Clemson makes $5 million and a player makes, the equivalent of, a four-year scholarship. And that, in this country, that system simply can't last just because of public perception, right? It just seems so wrong and so out of whack. And so that's been what has generated so much of the reform efforts, which is people just looking at the system and saying, this is a huge disparity. It has racial implications and lots of other implications. And so the public is moving away from accepting this ideal. Now, I think there can be arguments about, well, is this really ideal, right? Is this really what we should be tolerating or celebrating, this greater economic latitude? But I believe that is the direction that we're headed. But thanks for the good question.
Anyone else have a question?
Who hired Dr. Weinstein, and have the people who hired him, and have they looked back since his report now is discredited? Has his firm gotten any criticism, or who's this fellow you sent to us to do this and anything like that?
Yeah, so Ken Weinstein was, I don't think he's at the same law firm that he was back then, but I don't think he suffered any repercussions from this. But so he was hired by Carol Folt's team at UNC, and the release of the report was celebrated, and then the university backed away from it later. There's not been a ton of interrogation of the Weinstein report. I did a little bit of it in the book, but no, I mean, Carol Folt, UNC chancellor at the time, is now the chancellor or the president at the University of Southern California. One of the most interesting and disturbing parts of this story is that the people at the top made out just fine in this story, and the people who were not at the top did not make out fine.
That was going to be my question. That it seemed like a couple things. One, no one in senior administration, no tenured faculty members suffered any repercussions from this. And the fact that when they did the reports, they only looked back so far and sort of only, and it seemed like had a narrow enough focus to say, well, we can get by doing this, and then we can move on without really facing what happened.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I think.
I mean, is that?
Yeah, that's an unmistakable conclusion from this story and the way that it played out. The Weinstein report was, keep in mind that it was like the fourth major investigation that UNC had done. All the feedback they'd gotten at that point was, you guys are doing a terrible job of investigating, because the last one before the Weinstein report was led by former Governor Jim Martin, and he had to admit after came out that he didn't even look at any email records, and you can argue about whether emails
and
are
look back like 4 years.
Yeah, something like that, right? And over relying on emails is a mistake when you're investigating, but also not looking at them is not really something that is generally a good idea. And so at that point, you have a new chancellor. She's come in. She's like, we're gonna do a scorched earth report. We gotta get to the very bottom of this. She had support from I forget his name, I think it's the Orange County District Attorney who arranged the cooperation of Debbie Crowder and Julia Stangora, the two people at the heart of this thing. So, but it's hard to avoid the conclusion that this was a bloodletting, essentially, for the institution, a way to say we're taking serious action. We are going to bring down the hammer on some people. We're gonna put everything out there, and then we're going to move on. And so the dynamics are very troubling, because, like you said, there was a tenured faculty member who was barred from taking administrative roles in the future, and that's the most severe punishment that anybody who was a tenured faculty member or up suffered in this scandal. And I think it's a really troubling state of affairs, because, like I said earlier, in reporting a book like this, you sit down with people who had their lives turned upside down, and they're still having to deal with these consequences, and the senior administrators have moved on to other jobs and other presidencies, and that's something we have to grapple with. It's pretty distressing. Any other questions?
So you mentioned that this was probably really difficult and traumatic for some of your interviewees, and so I'm curious how you got people to sit down with you, and also how you kind of gained their trust throughout the course of this whole process.
That's a great question, and something I wrestled with a lot. And I didn't succeed with everybody. There were some people who never answered my emails. There's some people who answered one and just said, I can't go back to this topic. But know the way that you do it are you politely persistent, and you're very upfront with people. You're very upfront with them in that you want to hear their story, you want to help tell their story, but you are not their advocate. You have your own aims. You want to set forth this narrative, but for me, it was just being a very diligent listener and just expressing at every turn that I'm going to try to do the best job that I can here. I'm going to be straightforward the whole time. I'm going to tell you, we're going to fact check before the book goes to press. I'm going to tell you everything that you told me and that people said about you, so you have a chance to respond to it. And that's sort of the way that you do it. But in the moment, a lot of it is just sitting with people, being a good listener, and just being respectful of the fact that when it's in book form, it's just a name on a page. And this is one of the most interesting things about narrative nonfiction is, the really good stuff, a lot of times it reads like a novel. And for the reader, it's just a character. It's not a person. You're kind of imagining that maybe it's a real person out in the world. When you're reporting the book, it is a real person sitting in front of you, and you have to bring into agreement the ideas that this is a real person who exists in the world, but when they're on the page, they are going to be a character. And to do that in a way where you preserve your good conscience, you have to just be ultra straightforward with people about making sure they can answer any criticisms that are levied against them, or who can have the chance to know what's going to be said about them in a book. That's really hard, though. And that was probably the biggest challenge, one of the biggest challenges of doing this. Any other questions? There's like a couple minutes left.
Can you talk a little bit about the student reaction on campus when you were there as all of this was kind of coming out? And then, Praveena, I'd also be interested in your perspective about kind of in the culture shifts we've seen on campus since 2010, 2011, like would the reaction be any different if this happened today?
I'll just say first, really quickly, that the dominant student reaction on campus at the time was like, there was vague awareness that this was happening. We at the DTH, we were all very interested in it, obviously, but the general students, a lot of students are generally sort of not as engaged in following the news, and for a lot of students, if it doesn't affect their ability to go to games and celebrate campus culture that way, there's not a ton of engagement. So that wasn't really market at the time, but I'd be curious to see how it changed.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I would say that happens a lot where us at the DTH are very like, oh my gosh, and I'm like talking to my friends who don't work with me, and they're like, what?
Haven't you guys heard about the new dean search?
Yeah, I know. Like, I'm always like enthralled with everything, and they're like, can you shut up?
Yeah.
But I will say, I think given all of the issues at play here, so the systematic nature of the issue and also the role of race, where even in the book there's a passage about how it was predominantly teams with Black athletes kind of uplifting the teams that had predominantly white athletes in terms of like the football, basketball versus all of the other teams. And so I think with all of those things at play and kind of what students are interested in, and also all of the activism that we've seen on campus, I want to say that it would be a little bit more engaged now. And also with everything that we saw this summer, it was like students who were on the ground and protesting, and the student body president who kind of forced the board of trustees to vote on Nicolina Jones's tenure case. So I think from my perspective, working for the DTH, but also as a student for the past few years and everything that's gone on since this scandal has, I want to say that students would be more engaged than perhaps they were when it was going on.
And I'm just speculating, but I believe there would have been much more pushback on campus to the scapegoating of the Department of African and Afro-American Studies if it happened today. Now maybe the nasty rhetoric maybe would also have been elevated possibly, yes. But I think that's one thing we would have seen happen differently. Thank you, Praveena, so much for moderating. Thanks to everybody for coming. It's been a real pleasure.
Say a few things. Did I turn that off? I don't know. Thanks for coming tonight. Please keep an eye out for upcoming events in our newsletter, on our website, in our window, and on our table of books. We've got some great programs coming up on online and in person. And thanks again for supporting Flyleaf by coming tonight. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, thank you, Maggie.
Took me a minute.
Thanks so much. You did a great job. That's totally good. No. I'm much better with it.
I like it. I like it. Oh, really?
And you can take this book back.
Oh, yes, that's right. That's our copy.
Thanks so much for reading this and everything.
Yes, no, it was great. Thank you for emailing me about it and everything. And enjoy your time, your evening.
Yes, we'll do. Yeah. Yeah, and maybe, don't go back immediately. Just kind of hang out with wherever you want to go.
I've got a ride arranged when I get back from print.
Yeah. Cool. Thanks for doing this. It's been great. Yeah, thanks.
I was thinking about that tonight because it's just looking back at the decision, that's something that's contained about the Santa Claus, the Memorial Library, like was fascinating.
Yeah, I just mentioned it too as we were talking or something. Yeah, right.
And I'm thinking, here anyway. Yeah.
So what?
Keep up with you a little bit. I'm still.
What are you doing? What are you doing these days?
I'm the probate judge, Florence County now. Yeah.
Yeah. Great.
Yeah, I love it.